Meet Jordan, a 16-year-old black student in his junior year of high school. Jordan is bright, hardworking, and determined, with a passion for history and dreams of becoming a civil rights attorney. His mother, Mrs. Thompson, is a strong, supportive woman who has raised him to believe in himself and fight against injustice. Mrs. Thompson works 2 jobs but always makes time for Jordan's education, constantly encouraging him to strive for greatness despite the barriers society may place in his way. Jordan has always been a good student, excelling in most of his classes. However, his history class, taught by Mr. Granger, has become a source of frustration and anxiety for him. Mr. Granger, an older, jaded teacher, has shown signs of subtle racism, often dismissing Jordan's questions in class and undermining his contributions during discussions. Unlike other teachers, Mr. Granger never praises Jordan's work and constantly scrutinizes him, leading Jordan to feel isolated and underappreciated. This semester, things have taken a turn for the worse. Jordan, who has always earned high grades in other classes, is failing history for the first time. Despite turning in well-researched assignments and studying hard, he keeps receiving low grades from Mr. Granger. Jordan begins to suspect that his race is playing a role in Mr. Granger's treatment, but he struggles with feelings of self-doubt, wondering if maybe he just isn't good enough. Jordan is feeling deeply frustrated and disheartened. His confidence, once solid, has been chipped away by Mr. Granger's unfair grading and dismissive attitude. He worries that this failing grade will ruin his chances of getting into a good college and that all his hard work will be overshadowed by this one class. Jordan is caught between anger and sadness. He doesn't want to believe that someone in a position of authority would deliberately hold him back because of his race, but the evidence is hard to ignore. His mother, Mrs. Thompson, notices the change in Jordan's demeanor. She sees how much history class is affecting him, and after hearing about the consistent poor grades and Mr. Granger's biased behavior, she decides to take action. Mrs. Thompson, a fiercely protective mother, has always believed in fighting for what is right, and she refuses to let her son be a victim of discrimination. She plans to attend the upcoming parent-teacher conference to confront Mr. Granger about the unfair treatment her son is facing. The story opens with Jordan walking through the crowded halls of his high school, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face tense with frustration. The chatter of other students and the sound of lockers slamming fade into the background as he approaches Mr. Granger's classroom, dreading another day of feeling invisible. The classroom itself is described in detail: sterile, with faded history posters on the walls, rows of wooden desks, and Mr. Granger sitting at his desk, his eyes cold and disinterested as Jordan takes his seat. At home, we see a different side of Jordan. His room filled with college brochures and law books, his desk cluttered with notes and research papers. Mrs. Thompson is preparing dinner in the kitchen, her eyes occasionally flicking toward Jordan, concern etched across her face. She's proud of her son and determined to help him, no matter the challenge. This contrast between the warm, supportive environment at home and the cold, dismissive atmosphere at school sets the stage for the central conflict that is about to unfold. Mr. Granger, the history teacher, is the embodiment of outdated ideals and hidden prejudice. His behavior toward Jordan is never overtly racist in a way that could be easily called out. Instead, his bias is wrapped in microaggressions. He interrupts Jordan's answers during class, grades him more harshly than other students, and ignores his raised hand when he tries to contribute to discussions. To the casual observer, Mr. Granger is just a strict teacher, but to Jordan, it's clear that something more sinister is at play. Mr. Granger's condescending attitude stems from deep-seated biases, which he doesn't care to confront. He believes that students like Jordan aren't meant to succeed and reinforces that belief through unfair grading and dismissive behavior. To him, Jordan's consistent effort to excel is seen as a challenge, one that he's determined to suppress. The parent-teacher conference looms on the horizon, but Jordan's anxiety intensifies in the days leading up to it. He feels a mix of fear and helplessness. Fear that nothing will change, that confronting Mr. Granger will only make things worse, and helplessness because he feels trapped in a system that doesn't value him. The final straw comes when Jordan gets his latest test back. A C-, despite staying up late to study and feeling confident in his answers. Jordan sits at his desk, staring at the red marks slashed across his test paper. His heart pounds in his chest as anger and humiliation rise within him. He knows his answers were correct. His classmates who answered similarly got higher grades. It feels like a punch in the gut, a confirmation of what he has feared all along. Mr. Granger is failing him on purpose. As Jordan leaves the classroom that day, he overhears Mr. Granger making an offhand comment to a fellow teacher about how some students just don't put in the effort. It's a veiled remark, but Jordan knows it's directed at him. His hands clench into fists as he walks down the hall, his mind racing. He feels a surge of anger and shame. Anger at Mr. Granger's blatant unfairness and shame for not standing up for himself sooner. Jordan tries to talk to some of his friends about it, but most of them don't understand what he's going through. They brush it off, saying things like, "Mr. Granger's just tough on everyone," or "You'll be fine. It's just one class," but it's not just one class. For Jordan, it's the feeling of being singled out, of knowing that no matter how hard he works, he'll always be judged unfairly. His frustration builds, and he starts to feel isolated, as though no one else can truly understand what he's going through. At home, Mrs. Thompson senses something is wrong. She presses Jordan for more details about the class, and he finally opens up about how Mr. Granger has been treating him. Mrs. Thompson listens carefully, her expression growing more serious with each word. She's furious, but she remains calm, reassuring Jordan that they will handle this together. "I'm going to that conference," she says firmly, "and we're going to make sure this gets sorted out." Despite his mother's support, Jordan can't shake the feeling of vulnerability. He's afraid that confronting Mr. Granger will only lead to retaliation, that his grades might get even worse, or that the teacher will find some way to make his life harder. Part of him wants to just stay quiet, keep his head down, and hope for the best. But another part of him, the part that has always believed in justice and fairness, knows that staying silent isn't an option. The emotional toll on Jordan is palpable. He feels like he's failing not only in school but in standing up for himself. His self-esteem, once solid, is crumbling under the weight of Mr. Granger's persistent negativity. At night, he lies awake, replaying the moments in class where he was overlooked or unfairly criticized. He wonders if he should have spoken up sooner, if he should have done more to defend himself. These thoughts swirl in his mind, leaving him exhausted and stressed. The upcoming parent-teacher conference looms like a storm cloud on the horizon. Jordan doesn't know what to expect, but he knows it won't be easy. He fears that Mr. Granger will deflect responsibility, maybe even accuse him of laziness or disrespect. The thought of sitting in that room, watching his mother confront his teacher, fills him with dread. He's never seen his mother in full protective mode, but he knows she won't back down without a fight. In the days leading up to the meeting, small hints of the impending clash begin to surface. Jordan catches glimpses of Mr. Granger exchanging knowing glances with other teachers, as though preparing for the confrontation. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson begins gathering evidence: Jordan's past assignments, graded tests, and even the notes from other teachers praising his performance. She's building a case, determined to show Mr. Granger that her son's failure isn't due to a lack of effort or ability. The tension builds as Jordan tries to mentally prepare himself for the conference. His emotions are raw. He's angry, anxious, and scared all at once. He tries to focus on his other classes, but it's difficult when the weight of what's coming feels so heavy on his shoulders. Every day in history class is now a countdown to the inevitable confrontation, with Mr. Granger's disapproving gaze a constant reminder of the unfairness he faces. As the day of the meeting approaches, Jordan can't help but feel like a soldier preparing for battle. The stakes feel incredibly high, not just for his grades, but for his sense of justice and self-worth. In his heart, He knows that this meeting isn't just about proving Mr. Granger wrong. It's about standing up for himself, for the first time, in a way that could change everything. The day of the parent-teacher conference arrives, and the tension is palpable. Jordan and Mrs. Thompson walk into the school together, each step feeling heavier than the last. Jordan's heart pounds in his chest, his palms sweaty as they approach Mr. Granger's classroom. He's never been this nervous before. The hallways, usually filled with chatter, seem eerily quiet, amplifying the anxiety swirling inside him. They arrive at the door, and Mrs. Thompson's calm, determined presence gives Jordan a sliver of reassurance. She's always been his rock, but this situation feels different. He feels exposed, vulnerable, and terrified that his future might be at the mercy of someone who doesn't see his worth. They step inside, and there's Mr. Granger, sitting behind his desk, a smirk of thinly veiled arrogance on his face. His demeanor is cool and unbothered, like a man who believes he holds all the power in the room. His greeting is curt and professional, but Jordan can feel the underlying condescension in his tone. The small, cramped room feels even tighter under the weight of the tension between them. Mrs. Thompson begins by addressing the reason they're there. Her voice is steady but laced with a restrained fierceness. She lays out the facts calmly: Jordan's declining grades, the unfair treatment he has experienced, and her concerns about Mr. Granger's conduct. She speaks with the authority of a mother who knows her son's capabilities and refuses to let him be diminished. Mr. Granger leans back in his chair, his expression unchanged. He crosses his arms and sighs. His response is dismissive, claiming that Jordan's poor performance is simply due to a lack of effort. He suggests that perhaps Jordan isn't applying himself and that he's struggling with the material. Jordan feels a sharp pang in his chest, his stomach twisting into knots. The humiliation stings deeply. He knows it isn't true, but hearing it spoken aloud, in front of his mother, makes him feel small and powerless. Jordan's body tenses as Mr. Granger continues, painting a picture of him as lazy and disengaged. He fights the urge to speak up, feeling the lump of frustration rise in his throat. His hands grip the edge of his chair tightly, knuckles white, as he tries to hold back the wave of emotion threatening to crash over him. Mr. Granger's words are sharp and calculated, designed to strip Jordan of his dignity without ever explicitly saying anything overtly racist. He dances around the issue, implying that Jordan's failure is his own fault, that he simply isn't cut out for academic success. It's the same condescension Jordan has faced all year, now laid bare for his mother to hear. Mrs. Thompson's face hardens as Mr. Granger speaks. Her eyes narrow, and her calm demeanor begins to crack, revealing the fierce protectiveness underneath. She sees through Mr. Granger's thinly veiled insults, and it takes every ounce of her restraint not to lash out. Jordan, on the other hand, feels utterly defeated. His worst fears are being realized. He is being humiliated in front of his mother, made to feel like a failure, and there seems to be no way out of this. His mind races, heart pounding in his ears, as he wonders if this is how it ends. His dreams of success slipping away because of one teacher's bias. Just as Mr. Granger begins to wrap up his justification for Jordan's failing grades, there's a knock at the door. The door opens and in steps Ms. Garcia, the school's guidance counselor. She's a respected figure at the school, known for her fairness and dedication to helping students succeed. She's also someone who has always believed in Jordan's potential and has been quietly keeping an eye on his situation. Ms. Garcia wasn't scheduled to be part of this meeting, but she had heard enough whispers around the school about Mr. Granger's treatment of Jordan and decided to intervene. Her unexpected arrival shifts the energy in the room immediately. Mr. Granger's confidence falters, his smug expression replaced with a flicker of unease. Ms. Garcia smiles warmly at Mrs. Thompson and Jordan before turning her gaze to Mr. Granger. She calmly asks if she can sit in on the meeting, citing her role in overseeing student performance and well-being. Mr. Granger, clearly caught off guard, reluctantly agrees. With Ms. Garcia present, the dynamic of the conversation changes. She quickly brings up Jordan's performance in other classes, highlighting his high grades, strong work ethic, and glowing recommendations from other teachers. She tactfully questions why Jordan is only struggling in Mr. Granger's class, and why there seems to be such a stark contrast in his academic performance. Jordan feels a glimmer of hope. For the first time, someone is standing up for him, validating his efforts, and challenging the narrative that Mr. Granger has been spinning. His pulse still races, but now there's a different energy coursing through him. A sense of relief, a belief that maybe things could turn around. Ms. Garcia doesn't stop there. She presents a folder of Jordan's past assignments, some of which she's reviewed herself, and subtly implies that the grading discrepancies are unusual. The tension builds as she points out the lack of constructive feedback on Jordan's work, questioning how he's supposed to improve if Mr. Granger isn't providing clear guidance. Her voice is calm, professional, but firm, and Mr. Granger begins to squirm under the weight of her questioning. Mr. Granger tries to defend himself, claiming that his grading is objective and that he's simply holding Jordan to high standards. But Ms. Garcia presses him further, gently but persistently, asking him to explain specific examples of where Jordan's work fell short. Mr. Granger stammers, his earlier confidence crumbling under the scrutiny. As the conversation continues, Jordan's emotions are a whirlwind. He feels a strange mix of anger, fear, and, for the first time in weeks, a flicker of vindication. His hands, which had been trembling with tension, slowly unclench. His shoulders, once hunched in defeat, straighten ever so slightly. He's still nervous, but there's a growing sense of justice in the room. The tables are turning, and Mr. Granger is no longer the one in control. Mrs. Thompson, emboldened by Ms. Garcia's presence, speaks up once again, her voice calm but steely. She demands a clear explanation for Jordan's low grades and asks what steps Mr. Granger has taken to support her son's learning. The silence that follows is deafening. Mr. Granger, now visibly uncomfortable, mumbles something about offering extra help after class, something Jordan knows was never offered. Ms. Garcia steps in again, gently but decisively, suggesting that perhaps a review of Jordan's grades and assignments by an impartial third party might be in order. With that suggestion, Mr. Granger's facade fully cracks. He knows that an external review would reveal the truth, that his grading has been biased, and that he's been unfairly targeting Jordan. His protests grow weaker, and eventually, he concedes that perhaps he misjudged Jordan's performance and would be willing to revisit his grades. Jordan feels a rush of relief. The weight that had been pressing down on him lifts slightly, and for the first time in a long while, he feels like he can breathe again. His mother gives him a reassuring smile, her hand resting on his shoulder, and he knows that they've won. Not just the argument, but a piece of his dignity back. As they leave the meeting, Jordan feels a mix of exhaustion and triumph. His heart still races, but now with the adrenaline of victory rather than fear. He's shaken but stronger, knowing that he stood up for himself with the support of those who believed in him. As the parent-teacher conference ends, Jordan walks out of the school feeling lighter than he has in weeks. His heart still races, but the knot in his stomach is slowly loosening. For the first time, he feels like things are moving in the right direction. The injustice he's been silently enduring is finally being exposed. Mrs. Thompson walks beside him, her expression calm but satisfied. She doesn't say much as they leave the building, but her hand on Jordan's shoulder speaks volumes. She's proud of him, and Jordan can sense it. For a moment, neither of them speaks, both processing the weight of what just happened. But the silence is filled with a quiet sense of triumph. Once they reach the car, Mrs. Thompson breaks the silence. "You did great in there, Jordan," she says softly, her voice filled with both pride and relief. "We're going to get through this. Promise?" Jordan nods, feeling a surge of gratitude for his mother. She believed him when it felt like no one else did, and she fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself. He's still processing the whirlwind of emotions from the meeting, but for the first time in a long time, he feels hopeful. His dignity, which Mr. Granger tried to strip away, is slowly being restored. The consequences for Mr. Granger don't come immediately, but the seeds of karma have been planted. A few days after the conference, Ms. Garcia calls Mrs. Thompson to let her know that the school administration has decided to investigate Jordan's grades more thoroughly. Other teachers have started coming forward, quietly expressing their concerns about Mr. Granger's grading practices and the way he treats certain students. It seems Jordan wasn't the only one who felt singled out, and now the administration has reason to take a closer look. Mr. Granger's reputation, once untouchable, begins to fray at the edges. Word spreads among the faculty that he's under scrutiny, and he becomes more subdued in his classes, aware that every move he makes is being watched. He knows that if the investigation reveals the truth, that he has been grading unfairly and targeting certain students, his career could be on the line. The power he once wielded so carelessly is slipping from his grasp, and the arrogance that fueled his actions begins to dissolve into fear. For Jordan, the change is almost immediate. Mr. Granger, once cold and condescending, now avoids singling him out in class. He no longer dismisses Jordan's contributions or slashes his grades without reason. There's a new tension in the air, but this time, it's not directed at Jordan. Instead, it's Mr. Granger who seems uncomfortable, acutely aware that the eyes of the school are now on him. With the weight of Mr. Granger's unfair treatment lifted, Jordan starts to regain his confidence. His grades begin to improve, not because he's working harder, he was always working hard, but because he's finally being graded fairly. He no longer feels the sting of humiliation every time he hands in an assignment, and his enthusiasm for learning slowly returns. In history class, Jordan starts raising his hand again, contributing to discussions with a renewed sense of purpose. He's no longer afraid that his voice will be ignored or belittled. His classmates notice the change, too. They see him standing a little taller, speaking with more confidence, and they start to treat him with the respect he deserves. Even the friends who didn't fully understand what he was going through now look at him with a newfound admiration. At home, Jordan feels the shift as well. He's no longer quiet and withdrawn, no longer consumed by the fear of failure. Instead, he talks more openly with his mother about school, about his future, and about his dreams. The sense of hopelessness that once clouded his mind has been replaced with a growing belief that he can overcome whatever challenges come his way. For Jordan, the real triumph isn't just about the grades. It's about reclaiming his sense of self-worth. For weeks, he felt powerless, as though his future was slipping away because of one person's bias. Now, he feels like he's back in control of his life, and that feeling is more valuable than any grade. There's an emotional release not just for Jordan, but for the audience, too. After watching him struggle, endure humiliation, and feel the crushing weight of injustice, they can now celebrate his victory. His triumph is not just over Mr. Granger, but over the doubt and fear that had been eating away at him. It's a victory for resilience, for standing up against unfairness, and for refusing to be silenced in the face of adversity. Mrs. Thompson, too, feels the weight lifted. Her fierce determination to protect her son has paid off, and she can finally exhale, knowing that she's helped him regain his dignity. She watches as Jordan becomes more confident, more engaged, and more hopeful about his future. As a mother, there's no greater relief than seeing your child thrive, and she feels a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that she played a part in making that happen. Mr. Granger's quiet downfall. As for Mr. Granger, his downfall is a quiet one. The investigation into his grading practices doesn't result in a dramatic firing, but the damage to his reputation is done. The administration gives him a formal warning, and he's forced to change his behavior. His once untouchable status within the school is now tarnished, and he knows that any further missteps could cost him his job. More importantly, he loses the respect of his colleagues. The teachers who once turned a blind eye to his behavior now view him with suspicion, and his standing among them diminishes. He becomes more isolated, no longer the confident, domineering figure he once was. The power he used to wield over students like Jordan has evaporated, leaving him with the uncomfortable realization that he's no longer in control. For Jordan, knowing that Mr. Granger is facing consequences is enough. He doesn't need to see Mr. Granger completely fall from grace to feel vindicated. Just knowing that his voice was heard, and that justice was served in some form, is enough to give him peace. As the weeks go by, Jordan reflects on everything that's happened. He realizes that standing up to Mr. Granger, with the support of his mother and Ms. Garcia, was a turning point in his life. It taught him the importance of speaking out against injustice, even when it feels terrifying. It showed him that he has the strength to face adversity and come out stronger on the other side. In the end, Jordan's story is one of resilience, courage, and hope. He learned that no matter how hard things get, there are always people willing to stand by your side and fight for what's right. His victory is a reminder to the audience that, even in the face of unfairness, justice can prevail, and that standing up for yourself is always worth it. As Jordan looks back on the turbulent weeks that led to his confrontation with Mr. Granger, he feels a deep sense of transformation. What started as a series of humiliating experiences, being unfairly graded, doubted, and belittled, has turned into a personal victory. Jordan now understands that standing up for what is right, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you, is an act of courage that can change the course of your life. The journey wasn't easy. He felt the sharp sting of injustice and the emotional weight of self-doubt. But he also learned that he wasn't alone in his fight. His mother's unwavering support and Ms. Garcia's determination to do the right thing reminded him that there are allies in unexpected places. The feeling of isolation and powerlessness that once dominated his thoughts has been replaced with confidence and a belief in his ability to overcome obstacles. Jordan's story carries a deeper message about the importance of advocacy and resilience. When faced with injustice, it's easy to remain silent, to feel small and defeated. But Jordan's experience shows that one voice, backed by courage and persistence, can make a difference. It was his decision to speak up, his mother's fierce dedication, and Ms. Garcia's willingness to challenge the system that ultimately brought about change. This teaches a valuable moral lesson. When confronted with unfairness, whether it's in school, at work, or in life, you don't have to face it alone. By seeking out allies and standing firm in the belief that you deserve fairness and respect, you can push back against those who seek to undermine you. Resilience is not just about surviving difficult situations. It's about finding the strength to change them. Mr. Granger's downfall serves as a cautionary tale about the inevitable consequences of arrogance and cruelty. For too long, he wielded his power over vulnerable students, believing he could act without facing repercussions. His actions, born out of bias and spite, may have gone unchecked for years, but in the end, karma found its way back to him. The audience is left to reflect on this. When people abuse their authority, they may get away with it for a while, but justice has a way of catching up. Mr. Granger's fate wasn't dramatic or immediate, but it was a quiet, steady erosion of the influence he once held. His loss of respect among his peers and the scrutiny placed on him by the administration serves as a reminder that no one is immune to accountability. Jordan's victory prompts a larger question. How many others like him are still suffering in silence? How many students, employees, or individuals in various walks of life are enduring unfair treatment simply because they don't believe they have the power to fight back? This question lingers in the air, encouraging the audience to consider the importance of not only standing up for oneself, but also advocating for others who may not yet have found their voice. Jordan's story is a call to action for anyone witnessing injustice. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to speak out to spark change. Though Jordan's conflict with Mr. Granger has come to a close, his story feels like the beginning of a new chapter in his life. He has grown from this experience, emerging stronger, more self-assured, and more aware of his own capabilities. The bonds between him and his mother have deepened, and his relationship with Ms. Garcia has blossomed into a mentorship that will likely continue as he moves forward in his education. As for Mr. Granger, the audience is left to wonder how his future will unfold. Will he learn from his mistakes, or will he continue down the path of arrogance and denial, risking further damage to his career? The story doesn't answer this question directly, leaving room for the possibility of further developments. In the end, Jordan's story reminds us that life is full of challenges, but it's how we face them that defines us. It's about finding strength in the face of adversity, about knowing when to stand up for yourself, and about trusting that the truth has power, even in the face of authority. His journey reflects the resilience of the human spirit and the unshakable belief that fairness and justice, no matter how delayed, will prevail.